George Jackson. On January 13, 1970, at Soledad Prison, a yard fight ended when correctional officer Opie Miller opened fire and killed 3 black inmates. A grand jury ruled it justifiable homicide. 30 minutes after inmates heard that ruling over the prison radio, correctional officer John Mills was found dying in a Soledad wing, beaten and thrown from a third-floor tier. He was the first guard in the prison's history to die on the job. 3 inmates were charged with his murder: Fleta Drumgo, John Clutchette, and a 28-year-old named George Jackson. The press started calling them the Soledad Brothers. 7 months later, on August 7, 1970, George Jackson's 17-year-old brother Jonathan walked into a Marin County courtroom with a machine gun and took a judge and 3 jurors hostage, demanding the Soledad brothers be released. The escape attempt ended in a shootout outside the courthouse. Judge Harold Haley was killed. So was Jonathan Jackson. George Jackson wasn't there, but the state's response was to transfer him to San Quentin's Adjustment Center, the most restrictive unit in the prison, built to hold men the system considered too dangerous for anywhere else. That's where Jackson was still being held a year later, on August 21, 1971, 2 days before he was scheduled to stand trial for Mills's murder, when officers escorted his attorney, Stephen Bingham, in to meet with him. 20 days earlier, guards had caught a child visiting another inmate with a fake gun strapped to his ankle during a routine security screening. Nobody reported it up the chain of command. It was logged as a minor violation, not recognized as a dry run for something bigger. When the meeting ended, Correctional Officer Urbano Rubiaco walked Jackson back toward his cell and noticed something metallic tucked into his hair. He ordered Jackson to remove it. It was a wig, allegedly smuggled in along with a loaded Spanish Astra 9mm pistol hidden inside a cassette recorder. Jackson pulled the gun out and said, "This is it, gentlemen. The dragon has come." Jackson ordered the cells opened. With help from several other inmates, he overpowered the remaining officers on the tier and took them hostage. Then Lieutenant Dick Nelson, off duty and painting his dining room a few hundred yards away, grabbed a Thompson submachine gun from the armory and led the response. Inside the adjustment center, inmates were hollering, cussing, making threats about killing the hostages, Nelson later recalled. When gunfire down the tier had no effect, Nelson dropped to one knee and fired into the steel door himself, scattering the inmates long enough for 2 hostage officers to escape. By the time the tier was retaken, Sergeant Jerry Graham, Officer Paul Crazinez, and Officer Frank DeLeon were dead. Jackson was shot and killed by a tower guard as he sprinted across the yard. 2 more inmates, John Lynn and Ronald Kane, were also killed in the chaos, building trustees who had nothing to do with the escape plot but were in the wrong cell at the wrong time. It remains the deadliest single day in San Quentin's history. 3 officers and 3 inmates dead within minutes of each other. Attorney Stephen Bingham was charged with smuggling the gun and wig in for Jackson. He fled the country the same day and stayed a fugitive for 13 years before returning to the United States in 1984 to face trial. In 1986, a jury acquitted him of all charges. Jackson had already survived 1 hostage-taking built around him at the Marin County Courthouse. This time, he didn't survive at all. 6 inmates were charged over what happened in the adjustment center that day. 1 had already killed a guard 5 months earlier, using almost the exact same method, and almost nobody outside the prison knew it yet. Hugo Pinell. Hugo Pinell came to California from Nicaragua at age 12. By 19, he was serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole for rape with force, a conviction handed down in 1965. 6 years into that sentence, on March 3, 1971, 5 months before George Jackson's escape attempt, the 27-year-old called for a guard at Soledad Prison. Pinell told Correctional Officer Robert McCarthy he had outgoing mail to hand over. When McCarthy opened the food port on his cell door to collect it, Pinell stabbed him in the neck with a shank. McCarthy died at a hospital in Seaside the next morning. Pinell was already awaiting trial for assaulting a different guard in a separate December 1970 incident. None of that stopped him from getting a weapon and using it again. 5 months later, he was one of the 6 inmates charged in the Black August riot at San Quentin, where he slashed the throats of officers Urbano Rubiaco and Charles Breckenridge with razor blades embedded in a toothbrush handle. He said, "I love you pigs," and then he cut my throat, Rubiaco said afterward. Both officers survived by pretending to be dead. Pinell was convicted on 2 counts of felony assault, adding a 3rd life sentence, and spent the next 45 years in solitary confinement, among the longest stretches in California prison history, denied parole at least 9 times. In August of 2015, as part of a statewide push to move roughly 1,000 long-term isolation inmates into the general population, officials released Pinell into general population at California State Prison, Sacramento, for the first time in more than 4 decades. Within days, 2 fellow inmates stabbed him to death in the exercise yard. CDCR spokeswoman Dana Seamus confirmed to reporters afterward, he was definitely the target. His killing set off a riot involving roughly 70 inmates from multiple prison gangs. Guards fired warning shots and used pepper spray. 11 inmates ended up in outside hospitals, 70 people. That's how many joined the fight that broke out over one man's death, 44 years after the crime that made him famous. Pinell's attorney, Keith Watley, called the killing foreseeable. Pinell's daughter later sued the state for wrongful death, arguing officials knew he'd been threatened for years and put him on that yard anyway. Pinell's death proved that San Quentin's violence didn't stay contained behind one set of walls. It followed men for the rest of their lives, wherever the state sent them next. The gang forming around inmates like him was about to prove that same point in an even more organized way. Andre Johnson. On June 8, 1985, Sergeant Howell Hal Birchfield was walking the second tier of San Quentin's Carson section to take the evening count. Waiting in a darkened cell was 28-year-old inmate Andre Johnson, holding a prison-made spear. Just before 11:20 p.m., as Birchfield passed, Johnson thrust the weapon through the bars, striking him in the chest. Birchfield made it to the middle of the tier and tried to blow his whistle to call for help before he collapsed. He was pronounced dead at the institutional hospital a short time later. The killing wasn't random. Johnson, along with inmates Lawrence Woodard and Jarvis Masters, had planned it together as part of a black guerrilla family conspiracy formed the previous month to assault prison guards. The BGF itself had been founded inside San Quentin 2 decades earlier by George Jackson, the same inmate killed in the Adjustment Center in 1971. 14 years after his death, the organization he helped build was still operating inside the same prison, still targeting the same kind of victim. Birchfield had worked his way up from correctional officer to sergeant since starting his career in October 1974 at Folsom State Prison and was promoted to sergeant at San Quentin in 1983. He left behind a wife, Barbara, and 5 children. Johnson, Woodard, and Masters were tried at the same time in front of 2 separate juries, one for Masters and Woodard, another for Johnson. The prosecution's key witness, fellow gang member Rufus Willis, testified against all 3 under a grant of immunity, describing how the conspiracy came together in the weeks before the killing. Johnson's own letters, signed with the gang alias Ascari II, helped confirm who had sharpened the weapon before it reached him. The California Supreme Court's ruling described the case as involving the knowing and intentional killing of a peace officer, carrying out his duties. Johnson, convicted of stabbing Birchfield, and Woodard, convicted of helping plan and order the attack, were both sentenced to life without parole. Masters, convicted of sharpening the weapon and passing it along the tier, was sentenced to death, a disparity his supporters have pointed to for decades, since the man who delivered the fatal blow received a lesser sentence than the man who prepared the blade. If stories like this are the reason you're still watching, subscribe now. We cover the prisons, and prisoners other true crime channels won't touch, built entirely from court records and department files, not guesswork. 14 years after George Jackson, San Quentin had lost another sergeant to the exact same organized threat, a prison gang using the institution's own routines, like a nightly head count, as the opportunity to kill. The Black Guerrilla family outlived its founder by decades, but San Quentin's gang problem was never limited to one side of the yard. 2 decades before Birchfield's murder, a different group of inmates had built their own organization inside the exact same prison for the exact opposite reason. Barry Mills. In 1964, inside San Quentin's yard, a group of white inmates founded a gang they called the Aryan Brotherhood, springing out of an earlier 1950s clique known as the Bluebirds and forming as a direct response to prison desegregation and rising violence from Black inmate organizations. Barry Mills wasn't in that founding generation. He wasn't even incarcerated yet in 1964. He entered the California prison system in 1969 after an armed robbery conviction and joined the Aryan Brotherhood at San Quentin shortly after, rising through its ranks over the following decade. By 1980, as the gang restructured into a more formal chain of command, Mills and fellow inmate Tyler Bingham were selected to sit on a 3-man commission overseeing its operations across the federal prison system, a position that let him direct its growth from a 50 to 60 member state clique into an organization the Southern Poverty Law Center would later call the oldest, largest, and deadliest prison gang in the United States, with membership eventually estimated above 20,000. Its blood in, blood out membership rule required new members to injure or kill someone to join and made leaving alive nearly impossible. What started at San Quentin spread through the entire federal and state prison system, eventually linked to more than 100 murders. Mills himself did not stop being violent as his role in the gang grew. In 1979, at USP Atlanta, he lured a fellow inmate named John Marsloff into a bathroom stall over a gambling debt and nearly decapitated him, one of the defining stories of his career inside the system, but far from the last one. By the mid-2000s, federal prosecutors had spent 6 years building a case against Mills and 3 other Aryan Brotherhood leaders, tied to 32 murders and attempted murders across the federal prison system, one of the largest capital racketeering cases in American history. At trial, which opened in Orange County in March 2006, prosecutors argued that Mills and his co-defendant Tyler Bingham believed they held what one prosecutor called the sovereign right to dispense life and death inside America's prisons. Jurors convicted both men in July 2006 of racketeering, conspiracy, and multiple murders, including killings ordered through coded messages written in invisible urine ink. When other inmates heeded the letters to reveal the message hidden inside, it turned out to be a declaration of war against Black prisoners at USP Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. Within hours, gang members carried out the order, killing 2 men with handmade shanks. Mills was convicted of inciting that riot on top of everything else. When it came to sentencing, jurors deliberated for 3.5 days before telling the judge they were deadlocked on whether to execute Mills and Bingham. The judge declared a mistrial in the penalty phase, and both men were sentenced instead to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. Mills spent the rest of his life at the federal supermax in Florence, Colorado, where he was found dead in his cell on July 8, 2018, one day after his 70th birthday. The county coroner said the death did not appear suspicious and was likely from natural causes. San Quentin did not just fail to contain the Aryan Brotherhood's founding, it hosted the men who built it into a national syndicate and never fully stopped what started there. The gang Mills helped expand ran drug and murder operations across the federal prison network for more than 60 years, and it took a federal death penalty case just to slow it down. But not every inmate on this list needed a gang or 4 decades to make San Quentin more dangerous. Some only needed one afternoon. Richard Pinonuri. In January of 2006, a guard at San Quentin's East Block housing unit reached through the food port of condemned inmate Richard Pinonuri's cell door to remove his handcuffs. Pinonuri used a razor-like weapon to slash the guard's forearm nearly to the bone. The wound required 30 stitches, and the attack was serious enough to trigger a prison-wide lockdown while officials investigated. Pinonuri had been sentenced to death in Los Angeles County in February of 2001 for murdering two teenagers, 17-year-old Brian Molina and 18-year-old Michael Murillo, unintended targets of a gang-related shooting, and then ordering the murder of a witness, Jamie Castillo, who could have testified against him, already the kind of inmate the system was supposed to be watching most closely, housed in one of the 5 units at San Quentin built specifically to hold California's condemned population. That level of watching did not stop him from manufacturing a weapon inside his own cell and using it on the next guard who came near his door. A decade later, on October 3, 2016, Pinonuri did it again. As an officer removed his handcuffs in a shower stall in the same housing unit, Pinonuri grabbed the officer's right arm and cut it with another inmate-made weapon. CDCR described the result as a significant injury requiring outside hospital treatment. The officer recovered. So did the one from 2006. Both attacks opened an internal investigation referred to the Marin County District Attorney's Office. Neither one changed where Pinonuri was housed, who guarded him, or how his handcuffs were removed. He stayed in the same unit, went through the same food port and shower routine, and simply waited for the next opportunity. 2 attacks, 2 guards, 2 sets of stitches, 1 decade apart, and the exact same procedure still standing in between them, unchanged. 10 years and 1 repeat attack later, San Quentin still hadn't found a way to stop the same inmate from doing the exact same thing twice in the exact same unit. The next man on this list didn't wait 10 years between his crimes. He didn't even wait until he reached San Quentin. Anthony Delgado. Anthony Delgado's file at the California Department of Corrections started years before anyone died. He was first admitted to state prison from Monterey County in 1986 on a 4-year sentence for receiving stolen property and picked up a separate 2-year sentence that same year out of Solano County for possession of a deadly weapon by a prisoner, an in-custody offense. In 1990, Monterey County sent him back for second-degree burglary. None of that involved a killing. It was inside prison, on his 4th and 5th commitments, that his violence turned deadly. In 1998 at California State Prison, Corcoran, Delgado killed a fellow inmate named Frank Mendoza. The following year, at the same facility, he killed a second inmate, James Mahoney. Along the way, he also picked up a separate life sentence out of Lassen County in 1998 for threatening an officer and battering a non-inmate. In June of 2000, Delgado was sentenced to death and transferred to San Quentin's death row, arriving with 2 in-custody murders and more than a decade of escalating prison offenses already on his record. San Quentin housed him anyway in the adjustment center, alongside the rest of the state's condemned population, with the theory that concentrating the most violent men in one controlled unit made everyone safer. On the morning of April 20th, 2017, just after 9 a.m., while Delgado was undergoing a routine medical exam, an officer stood by to provide coverage, the same precaution used for every condemned inmate during a medical visit. Delgado attacked him anyway with an inmate-manufactured weapon. CDCR spokeswoman Terry Thornton confirmed the officer suffered a significant facial injury and was taken to an outside hospital. He was expected to make a full recovery. Delgado had killed twice before arriving at San Quentin, on top of a string of lesser offenses stretching back more than a decade. The prison's answer was to house him in its highest security unit and hope that record was finally contained. It wasn't. By 2019, California had placed a moratorium on executions, meaning every man on this list was going to keep living on death row indefinitely, not moving toward any final outcome. Delgado wasn't the only condemned inmate treating that indefinite stay like a place he could keep hurting people from. The same pattern kept repeating, with different names, different weapons, and different guards paying the price. Jesse Manzo. In 2008, gang member Jesse Manzo murdered a man named Raymond Franklin. Prosecutors classified it as a gang-related hate crime, the kind of killing California treats as an aggravating factor at sentencing precisely because it's aimed at a category of victim, not a personal grievance. He was sentenced to death in Riverside County on August 2nd, 2013, at the age of 24, and sent to San Quentin's death row, where CDCR would later describe him in an official release as a self-admitted gang member, not a suspected one, an admitted one, which is exactly the profile the housing unit was designed around. On June 9th, 2016, just after 5 p.m., an officer was escorting Manzo from the shower back to his cell in the East Block housing unit, following the same handcuffing procedure used on every condemned inmate in that block, when Manzo slipped one hand out of an open cuff. He used the restraint itself as a weapon, striking the officer several times in the face. Responding officers used pepper spray and batons to end the attack. The blows caused a significant facial injury. The officer was taken to an outside hospital and later expected to fully recover. That year, San Quentin's death row held 747 condemned men, the largest in the country, all cycling through the exact same shower and cuff routine, several times a day. Manzo's attack didn't lead to a redesign of the shower and cuff routine. The same basic procedure was still standard practice when a different inmate turned it into an opportunity of his own, this time going after 2 officers instead of 1. Manzo didn't need a shank, a razor, or a smuggled weapon. He turned the restraint meant to control him into the weapon itself, inside one of the most secure housing units in the entire California prison system. A handcuff was dangerous enough in Manzo's hands alone. The next inmate on this list needed both of his hands free because he went after 2 officers at the exact same time. Timothy Joseph McGee. Between 1997 and 2001, gang member Timothy Joseph McGee led a Los Angeles gang called Tunerville, commanding roughly 200 members who controlled the Atwater Village area along the LA River. During that 4-year run, McGee was tied to the first-degree murders of 3 people and the attempted murders of 4 others, including 2 LAPD officers, all connected to his effort to control narcotics distribution in the neighborhood. It took prosecutors years to build the case, and McGee landed at one point on the U.S. Marshal Service's list of the 15 most wanted fugitives. A Los Angeles County jury sentenced him to death on January 9, 2009, at age 39, and CDCR sent him to San Quentin, joining the same death row population as Manzo, Delgado, and Pinonuri. Just before 7 a.m. one morning in the adjustment center, 2 correctional officers opened McGee's shower door to return him to his cell, the exact procedure Manzo had already exploited once. McGee attacked both officers at once, using a weapon he had made himself to cut and stab them on their heads, necks, and arms. Prison staff moved quickly enough that both officers survived their injuries. Both were taken to an outside hospital. Both were expected to recover. "I don't know why he decided to attack," CDCR spokeswoman Terry Thornton told reporters afterward. The adjustment center is one of 3 separate units at San Quentin built specifically to hold male condemned inmates, meant to be the most tightly controlled space in the entire prison. It took 2 officers working together to move one condemned man 20 feet inside that unit, and it still wasn't enough to keep them safe. 2 officers hurt in the same few seconds. During a task, the unit ran dozens of times every shift. It was one of the closer calls on this list, but San Quentin's death row wasn't only turning on the officers guarding it. 2 years after Pinell's death across the state, the violence turned inward onto another condemned inmate instead. Luis Rodriguez. On October 5, 2018, just before 10 a.m., in a recreation yard reserved for San Quentin's condemned population, 34-year-old Luis Rodriguez confronted fellow death row inmate Jonathan Fajardo. Rodriguez stabbed Fajardo in the chest and neck with an inmate-made weapon. Fajardo, 30, was pronounced dead less than an hour later, the first killing of a death row inmate anywhere in California in more than 20 years since 1997. Death row is supposed to be the most controlled population in the most controlled prison in the state. Every inmate housed there is already condemned for murder. Fajardo himself had been sent to San Quentin carrying a death sentence for 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and 7 consecutive life sentences on top of it for a racially motivated killing of a 14-year-old girl and the stabbing death 2 weeks later of a man his own gang associate suspected of cooperating with police. Rodriguez arrived from Los Angeles County as well, first sent to prison in 2008 on a life with parole sentence before being condemned to death in September 2015 for 2 additional murders of his own. San Francisco State University Associate Professor Amy Smith, who studies the psychological impact of capital punishment, called the killing very unusual. Not because death row inmates are less violent than the general population, but because California's own security measures were specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of killing from happening at all. They didn't. CDCR spokeswoman Terry Thornton said investigators were still trying to determine how Rodriguez obtained or manufactured the weapon in the first place, on a yard meant to be the safest, most watched space in the entire institution. Every inmate on that yard is housed separately in his cell, but California allows condemned men to gather in small groups outdoors. And it was in exactly that window, the one moment of the day death row inmates aren't fully isolated from each other, that Fajardo was killed. San Quentin had already seen guards attacked by Delgado, Manzo, and McGee, all within that same stretch of years. Rodriguez's case showed the threat wasn't limited to staff. Condemned inmates were just as capable of turning San Quentin's death row into a place where a fellow prisoner, not just a guard, could end up dead. If a maximum security death row yard couldn't stop one condemned inmate from killing another, then California's plan for its most violent men was starting to run out of places left to send them. One inmate on this list would spend the next 2 decades testing exactly how far that problem could go. Todd Givens. In 1997, in Tulare County, Todd Givens and his wife Lacey murdered a brother and sister, Barry and Patrice Holstone, then burned their bodies inside a car in an olive orchard near Givens's home. Prosecutors argued Givens ordered the killings because he believed Barry Holstone had stolen from him, and that the murders were tied to Givens's role in the Nazi Lowriders, a white supremacist prison gang allied with the Aryan Brotherhood. Givens was sentenced to death in 2004. Lacey was convicted of helping dispose of the bodies and sent to the state's women's prison with a sentence of life without parole. Givens went to San Quentin's death row, where, according to one local columnist who covered his trial, he displayed a tattoo of Adolf Hitler across the back of his shaved head. Death row didn't slow him down. In 2006, Givens and 2 other San Quentin inmates were accused of stabbing Curtis Price, a fellow condemned inmate, Aryan Brotherhood member, and convicted double murderer, proof that the violence on death row wasn't only aimed at guards. Inmates like Givens were just as willing to turn on each other. 14 years later, on the morning of July 16, 2020, Givens reached through the food port of his own cell as an officer collected breakfast trays and tried to slash the officer's throat. The weapon, according to a CDCR news release, was made from 2 razor blades and a sharpened, broken piece of nail clippers. The officer grabbed it with his left hand, was cut as Givens pulled the weapon back, and received 5 stitches at a hospital. He survived. Givens was moved into the adjustment center pending investigation, the same unit that had once held George Jackson, and the same unit Anthony Delgado had once called home to. That should have been the end of his file. It wasn't. San Quentin eventually moved Givens out of the institution entirely, first through other units in the CDCR system and eventually to Salinas Valley State Prison. The transfer didn't stop what nearly 2 decades of documented violence had already made clear. On October 23, 2025, just before 10 a.m., prison staff in a recreation yard watched Givens and 2 other inmates, Ray Waldron and Robert England, both convicted murderers like Givens, and both marked with visible white supremacist tattoos according to CDCR photos, surround a 4th man and attack him with improvised weapons. Staff shouted orders to stop, but by the time responders arrived, the attack was already over. The victim, 57-year-old Todd Fox Morgan, was pronounced dead minutes later. Morgan was serving both a state sentence under California's 3 strikes law and a 21-year federal sentence tied to a large-scale prison drug trafficking ring, a case that had stemmed from a 2020 federal indictment targeting the Aryan Brotherhood and allied white supremacist gangs across California, including the Fresno-based Fresnex. Officers recovered 3 inmate improvised weapons at the scene. Morgan's death became one more piece of evidence inside that same federal effort, proof that California's prison gang violence had grown large enough to require federal intervention, not just internal discipline inside a single facility. All 3 suspects in Morgan's killing were moved into restrictive housing while the investigation continued, the same response San Quentin had used on Givens back in 2020. It hadn't worked then either. Givens had been on San Quentin's death row when he first tried to kill a guard over a plate of breakfast trays. 5 years and at least 1 transfer later, he was still killing, just somewhere else, against a different kind of victim. Every inmate on this list started inside San Quentin's walls. Some, like George Jackson and Hugo Pinell, made their names there and never left. Others, like Givens, carried what they learned inside those walls to whatever prison came next. San Quentin didn't create Todd Givens, but for nearly 20 years, it also never stopped him. It only ever moved him 1 prison further down the line. If this kind of research is what keeps you coming back, subscribe and turn on notifications. New prison case files go up every week, sourced straight from court records and CDCR documentation. Thanks for watching.